As Nathan said, we're continuing in our series tonight, Panorama. And as we begin, I was just I woke up this morning. It was really interesting. I woke up this morning and my head was just so stuffy. And here's why: the fires, first of all, like the smoke from the fires, like as devastating as those things are, and it's unbelievable what's going on. And I don't know, I've never really experienced anything quite like this. All this smoke. In fact, it was funny because we'd had a campfire and done s'mores the night before all the smoke rolled in, and I know it probably wasn't a good idea. Later on, we're like, I don't think we were allowed to do that, but we didn't ask for permission. We just asked for forgiveness. But I woke up in the morning, and there was all this smoke in the air, and I was like, wow, our fire really smoked up the neighborhood last night, and I felt bad for our neighbors, and then later realized, oh no, there's something major going on. So I'm real allergic to wood smoke, so kind of driving me crazy all week. And then yesterday, to make matters worse, weeds. I have weeds around my house. There's some vacant lots, and I decided to get the weed whacker out and just go to town with dust and pollen and spores and no mask. And so I was just an allergic mess last night. And I woke up this morning and my head was just completely stuffed, horribly, just completely stuffed up. And I got up and I got my coffee and I sat down. Kind of normal Sunday morning to sit down with my coffee, and I drank my coffee. And as soon as I drank it, I was like, I don't taste anything. I was so stuffed up, my sense of taste was completely gone. Have you ever had that happen where your sense of taste, three of us? Okay, yeah, a few of us. So sense of taste completely gone. I literally looked at it and I was I thought for a second that I didn't make coffee. Am I just drinking warm water? And so I looked down, I'm like, no, that's coffee. And it's that surreal moment of, I don't taste anything. And while I was sitting there drinking the coffee, I suddenly realized, I thought, you know what? This is an amazing illustration for the Christian life for a lot of people. There's this sense that as we bring the cup of faith to our lips, that we should taste something. There's an expectation that it should be a certain way, but then as we drink it down, we're like, there's just something that seems to be missing. Something's off with this. The sense of taste has been altered. There's something wrong with our experience. And I use that illustration because I want to say that the series that we're in, the desire of this series is to acknowledge right away and say, that is a reality. I think for many people, our faith experience, there's something off in that. And our hope in this series is that we could correct some of the thinking and maybe open our eyes to some of the perspective of who God is and what He's doing, so that gap, that distance, or that lack of taste of what we expected it would be eliminated, and we would experience faith in the Christian life the way we were intended to. And so part of this series has been us really taking a step back and trying to get a better perspective. Because I think for most of us, what we've experienced with Christianity is a very individualized, very personal experience. But oftentimes it's been individualized and personalized to a point that we've missed out on significant components of what it means to be a Christ follower. And so our experience, while very authentic and genuine, it isn't the robust, complete experience that we were intended to have. And so we need to see larger perspectives. We need to see the bigger view of what God is doing. And so that's why we've spent some time talking about the mission of God. We've been talking about the reality that God is a God who is on and of mission, versus a God who's removed and hiding and off someplace in this cosmic distance where He's removing Himself from us and cloaking Himself from our view. Instead, what we've been discovering is that as you read the pages of the Bible and you look in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the stories over and over again are a God who is on mission, a God who is pursuing humanity, and not just pursuing humanity for the relationship. That's an important part of it. And certainly God pursues us, pursues you and I, and pursues humanity in order to establish relationship. But we also see that in pursuing that relationship, God is also pursuing a larger mission, a larger desire that He has for the human experience. The mission of God is that we would be a part of, be experiencing human flourishing. In fact, one of the things we've talked about in this is this idea that really the story of the Bible, the story of the gospel, is summarized in 4 really large, sweeping chapters. That we really see that there's the story of the fall, where it explains why things are the way they are. Then we've seen that there's this, or the story of creation, that explains how things could be. Then the fall, that explains how things are. And then we've been talking about redemption and the reality that things do have the opportunity to change. But what we so oftentimes miss out on is this story, this chapter of renewal, that there is an aspect to what God's doing where he doesn't just want to redeem you as an individual, but he wants to see all things renewed, that everything would be renewed and redeemed, that there would be the restoration of all things. This idea that humanity's experience in life, that we would be increasingly more joyful and peaceful, that we would experience more love and more grace, that this world would be rid of injustice and poverty and suffering, and that we would be moving in a trajectory that's constantly closer to flourishing. And so God's desire for humanity is that not only do you and I experience this on an individual level, but we participate with God to bring that about. That we would be a people who are thinking, how does my life contribute to the renewal of all things? In fact, last week, that's very specifically what we talked about, the duality of this. We looked at the story of Jesus and Lazarus and how Jesus defined the human condition as lostness, and he defined his mission as seeking and finding those who were lost. And in doing that, Jesus presents a duality, this fact that not only do you and I experience being found, but we also are engaged now in the mission of dealing with the lostness of humanity. What we're seeing is that as this picture gets larger, the more we get the perspective of what God's doing, the more we desire to understand our place in it. See, there's this reality that when you start to understand the mission of God, and for some of you, maybe you've experienced this, when you start to see the curtain pull back or the fog lift, and you suddenly get this vision of what God hopes for humanity, the reality is you can no longer be content just getting up in the morning and getting by. Suddenly, the reality of what God is doing, the truth of Him being a God of and on mission, demands that we wrestle with and answer questions about the mundane aspects of our life, that we actually wrestle with, what am I really doing, and how does my faith really get lived out, not just for an hour on Sunday, but how does my faith impact how I work and what I work in and how I play and how I recreate, and does my faith have an influence on all those things? The more we understand the larger perspective of who God is and what He's doing, the more that demands an answer to the daily life that we have. Like tomorrow, we wake up tomorrow morning and what? What does that mean? This demands these sorts of answers. So this evening, we're going to dig a little bit deeper and ask some more questions about what this means truly for everyday life, because the gospel should, and I'll say this, the gospel should resolve that for us. The gospel should resolve more than just, I know where I'm going when my life on earth is over. The gospel should resolve all of life. Like, what are we really doing? What are we really here for? The gospel should answer those questions. The gospel should bring meaning and value and truth to every moment of every day, no matter where we are. It should have that influence. So how does that happen? What does that look like? How do you and I become people who actually have that experience and the separation, the dichotomy between spiritual and everything else is eliminated? We're going to look tonight at one word. There's one word that's used throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament that I think helps us unpack this. What does this really look like to live this out as an individual? One word. Now, what's interesting is, oftentimes when we read the Bible and we look at the teaching of Jesus, Jesus actually uses words to describe humanity that sometimes we find offensive. Like even last week, we look at the word lost. And for some of us, there's something that takes place inside of us. There's like a sense of either self-preservation, or there's a sense of pride, or something inside of us that we resist certain terms. And so when Jesus describes the human condition as being lost, there are some of us that go, I'm not lost. Why would you call me lost? You know, and we kind of press up against those things because we don't want somebody defining us with terms that we're not comfortable with. And the reality is the term that we're going to look at tonight that I think helps us unpack how we live our life every day is one of those terms that when you first hear it, in the first moment, there may be something inside of you, I'll warn you with this, there may be something inside of you that either you say, what? Like, I don't get it, and hopefully by the end you do, or you might say, no, like why? Why would you call us that? Why would we be described that sort of way? The word is this, the word is exiles. The single word that helps us unpack and understand how do you and I live our life in the world that we live in? How do you and I navigate this world, daily life? The word that helps us unpack and understand this is the word exile. I want to talk about this and what it means, but I want to really take a closer look at some specific things regarding this word. Peter wrote several letters, and one of his letters is included in the New Testament, in 1 Peter. And so if you don't have a Bible tonight, the words will be on the screen. But if you have your Bible, I want you to open up to 1 Peter chapter 1. We're actually going to look at two different places in 1 Peter tonight. But this helps us understand not only this word exile, not only the definition of this word and what it means, but it also helps us decipher how we really live our life. Like, how do we live this life out? So 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, I want you to understand that Peter in this moment is writing to Christians. He's writing to people who have made the decision to follow Christ. They've had a faith encounter with God through Jesus, and so they would call themselves Christians. Peter is writing this letter to them, and I want you just to listen to how it starts. He says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, and then listen to this, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. I want to pause right there. Peter refers to these people as exiles. You are exiles. There's this group of people who are scattered in all of these provinces, all of these states, all of these different places. They have different nationalities, different racial heritages. They have all of these different attributes about them that make them different. But Peter refers to them, this scattered group of people who are called to live out God's purposes in all these places. He refers to them as exiles. You who are exiles living in all of these different places. Now that's a really interesting idea. Why would Peter call these people exiles? Because they live in Pontus and Galatia and Cappadocia and Asia and Bithynia. Why wouldn't he say to you, the Bithynians, to you? Peter's being very intentional in saying there's a distinction. There's something about you that's different. You are in exile. Now, in the first week in this series, we saw a picture of what it means to be in exile. Jeremiah chapter 29. The people of Israel, while not necessarily used as an example or being told that they're in exile necessarily for a few years, they experienced this firsthand. Jeremiah chapter 29, there's this situation that's taking place where Israel has been conquered by the Babylonian nation. The Babylonian Empire's way of dealing with opposing nations, rather than killing the population of that nation and rather than enslaving them as previous empires had done, the Babylonians had this practice of absorbing and assimilating the people of that nation into their own. And so the idea was they would go to a nation, they would conquer it, and they would take all of the influential people, the young, the leaders, the cultural elites, and they would drag them off to Babylon, and then they would integrate them into the Babylonian culture. As the people lived in that culture, pretty soon they would be absorbed, the distinctives of their previous lives would be lost, and they would now be Babylonians. The people of Israel get conquered, and they get carried away to Babylon, and when they get there, basically they say, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to press against this captivity. We're not going to be assimilated. And they make the decision, the leaders of Israel make the decision to separate themselves from the city of Babylon. And they build literally a sort of village outside of the city where their only interaction with Babylon is just for commerce or to do business. We're going to minimize the amount of interaction we have and separate ourselves from ever being involved in what's going on in this city. The tension arises as it becomes evident that God's desire for them is to not live as a separated people, but that God's desire is actually for them to live within the walls of Babylon, to actually engage the city. And there's this amazing moment when Jeremiah speaks to the people of Israel, and he says that the word of the Lord is that they would move into the city, that they would build houses and plant gardens, and let their sons and daughters marry. And then he says that you would seek the peace of the city to which I have carried you into exile. You have been carried there as exiles. And he says, you seek the peace of the city, because as the city prospers, so shall you prosper. And the apparent truth in Jeremiah 29 is that God has intentionally carried the people of Israel into a position of exile. And from that position of exile, they are now called and put in a position of influence in that city. They have a purpose. They have a reason for being exiles. Fast forward to the New Testament, and now we have Peter not referring to the people of Israel, but now we have Peter referring to people like you and I. He's looking at you and I. He's looking at us. He's looking at Christians, and I'm not assuming that all of us are, but for those of us that have made the decision to follow Christ, Peter is now looking at all of us, and he says, you, residents of Spokane and Spokane County, you, exiles. And he summarizes who they are and defines them with this word, exile. It's no longer Israel, but it's now us. And these people that Peter was referring to, they were so similar in every way to us. Peter is defining Christ followers with this term, exile. And so God's purpose throughout history has been to bring about his mission, to glorify himself, and to move towards human flourishing. And it's always been through a group of people that he does that. And yet that group of people is defined by this idea, this reality of being an exiled nation, an exiled group of people. This word, it defines us, and then it helps us translate, helps us decipher, helps us understand life. We're going to talk about a couple of different things. When we think about the word exile, there's a lot of different ways that this plays out. And you could think about this literally for days. You could just think about all the implications, but I want to look at a couple specific ones tonight. When you start thinking about what it means to be an exile, because basically what Peter is saying and what I'm saying is that you, all of us together, we are exiles. Well, what is true of exiles? If we understand what's true about the exiles, then we will understand certain truths about ourselves and our position that help make sense of this crazy life that we're living. It helps make sense of tomorrow morning when we get up, or the possessions that we own, or the habits and hobbies that we have in our life. If we understand what's true about exiles, then we'll understand what's true about us, and suddenly the pieces of this puzzle, for many of us, may come together. So what's true about exiles? Here's one thing. If you're taking notes, here's one thing to write down. Exiles are guests. Exiles are guests. Exiles are not citizens, right? Exiles don't own the land they're in. Exiles literally are guests. They're guests in whatever location they are. So the idea is, instead of being hosts, instead of being the owners, instead of being those that are in control, exiles are always the people who are entering a situation or living in a particular place as guests. Now, what's fascinating about this is that we actually see this rooted in God's behavior towards humanity. This God of mission who is pursuing us. What's unbelievable is that when you think about how God comes to us, God always comes as a guest. God doesn't come as the host. God doesn't create the perfect environment. God comes as a guest. All the way back to the very beginning in the Old Testament, and you see God entering the scene with Abraham and making himself known to Abraham. Where does God enter the scene? He enters in the context of an existing Sumerian religious system. A Sumerian religious system that actually had many things that were contrasted against who God is in his character, and yet God found himself coming through that scenario to present himself to Abraham. And so Abraham is introduced to God on Abraham's turf and terms. And then it's in the context of that Sumerian history and Abraham's cultural background that God begins to reveal himself to Abraham and reveal his character to him by saying things like, you know what, this is how you've behaved in the past, but that's not who I am, and that's not who I want you to be. I mean, it's even in the picture of him taking Isaac up to the altar. It's God saying to Abraham, I know that the gods that you've worshipped in the past have been those kinds of gods that demanded the sacrifice of children, but I'm not that kind of God. And there's this beautiful story of God reshaping Abraham's thinking about how to relate to God. But God enters this scenario in a way that made sense, in a way that Abraham could understand. God came to Abraham as a guest. As you read the Old Testament over and over again, you see God coming and being a guest, not a host. Then we see Jesus, even the story we looked at last week, the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. And in this moment of Jesus meeting Zacchaeus, what does Jesus say to him? He says, I'm going to go to your house. Let's go stay at your place. Jesus doesn't come. We see this over and over again. We see Jesus over and over again going to other people's homes. We see Jesus in this scenario not coming to this point of conversation with Zacchaeus and saying, listen, I want you to come over to my house. I want you to come and I want you to eat my food, and I want you to drink what I serve to drink, and I want you to have the conversation in an environment that I'm comfortable in. I want you to sit on my couch and in my home. Actually, Jesus does just the opposite. He says, I want to go to your house. I want to go to the place where you're comfortable. I want to go to the place where you serve the food and you choose what we're going to talk about. Like, Jesus puts himself in the situation of being a guest. And over again, we see Jesus operating as a guest. Now, it's interesting because the way we tend to function as humans and the way the church and even Israel functioned and the church functioned at different times in history is to function as hosts. We want to be hosts. We want to be the ones in control. We want to be the ones who say, we create the environment, we have power, we have control, and we invite people into an environment where they agree with us, where we have the ability to say what goes. And yet the model of God himself and the model that's being given to us and being named exiles is that we're guests. We're not hosts. When you're a host, you're the one that's comfortable. I think this is always very interesting. Like when you're a host, this is fascinating. But when you're hosting somebody over your house, you're always like, I just want them to come over. I want them to be comfortable. I want them to relax. I just want you, hey, make my house is your house. Make yourself at home. We say those kinds of things. And when we're a host and we're doing that, and we're having somebody over, that's most of the time, that's a very genuine response from us. It's like, I just want you to make yourself at home. On the flip side of that, how many of you, when somebody's hosting you, really do make yourself at home? Like, there's this fascinating that happens that when you're a guest, no matter how accommodating that person is, there's always a part of you that's a little bit like, I got to be on my best behavior, right? Like, there's a part of you that, like, when you show up there and you're hanging out and at a certain point in the evening, you need to go to the bathroom, what do? You ask permission to go to the bathroom. Right? Isn't that a great indication of how uncomfortable you are that you say, do you mind if I use your restroom? Well, if this is your home, do you ask to use the restroom in your home? Or like if you have kids and you're driving up to someone's house and they're hosting you and you're the guest, when you're driving up to the house with your kids, here's the conversation parents have with their children. Okay, you eat what's put in front of you. If it is horrible, sneak it out of your mouth and feed it to the dog without anybody looking. If you get caught, I disown you, right? Like, that's the conversation. Like, kids, be on your best behavior. Why? Because when you're a guest, this is what's ironic about the whole concept. When you're a guest, you actually are accommodating the host. You actually are giving them preferential treatment. You are putting aside your preferences in order to accommodate them. And so the picture that we're being given of who we are is that of exiles and guests, that the land that we are in, the place that we are, is not a place where we are ever intended to be as hosts, but we're intended to live here and to operate and to function as guests. Which means it's not about our preferences. It's not about us getting our way. It's not about what we would like to have or what we want people to say or not say. It means that we are continually thinking about how we can be the best guest, that rhymes, possible, the way that Jesus was. When we understand these things, it suddenly lets some of the things that Jesus said, it makes them that much more powerful. There's this conversation that Jesus is having with his disciples where he's talking about the reality of engaging in the mission of God and actually pursuing people in their lostness and really being a person who's out there. And it's in Matthew chapter 5, and listen to what he says. Jesus says this, he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." So Jesus says, you exiles, you the guests, you are like salt. And what I love about this is that nowhere does Jesus say you are the main course. You're not the meat and potatoes. You are the salt. What does salt do? Salt, when it is in proximity to food, draws the best out, right? It draws the flavor out. It draws the brightness out, right? It's what gives it its flavor. And so what Jesus is saying to his disciples is that proximity matters. As guests, you're living out in culture for the purpose of bringing out the flavor of where we live. You are intended to be in proximity and salty with people. That's who you're intended to be. Now, our tendency is just the opposite. Just like Israel back in Jeremiah, when they got to this place, they said, no, we're not going to be sucked in to the ways of the Babylonian culture. And so their response to that was just to say, well, then we're going to keep ourselves separated. Well, that was never God's intention for them, and it's never God's intention for us. There's no place where God says the only way that you can maintain who you are is to be separate. God doesn't describe that or prescribe that for us as his people. He says, I want you to be salty, which means you live in proximity. You don't create a Christian subculture and remove yourself from society. We have this crazy tendency, like we start a Christian this and that all the time. There's like Christian hot yoga, right? There's like Christian books, and there's Christian music, and there's Christian this and Christian that. And the reality is the only thing that can be a Christian is a human being, because Christian means to follow Jesus. And last time I checked, books don't actually get up and follow Jesus. But what all of those things are is evidence that we like to create a host environment for ourselves. We like to create a separatist culture where we're apart from everything. And what Jesus is saying is, I want you to be salty. I want you to be out there. Now, do I want you to be absorbed by the culture? No, by no means. I want you close in proximity, and I want you influencing. I want you there, but I want you to be distinct and different in the middle of this. See, the gospel requires that we are out living life in proximity to humanity so that we can be a part of bringing about the renewal of all things. Now that brings up, I think, another issue that we tend to wrestle with as exiles or as people just living. Like, how do I live? Like, how do I balance? How do I balance just the stuff of life? Like, that's a real challenge. Like, I think sometimes we can get together in a room and we can worship and we can listen to teaching and we're like, man, this is really good. And I'm really excited to be a Christian. And then wake up tomorrow and we're like, how in the world does this relate? In fact, last week, if you weren't here, we did this brainstorming of what we value, and we had this board with all these things on it. And we were talking about those things, and what was interesting is as we talked about them, we said that most of these things that we identified, things like jobs and things like houses and cars and education and status and children and recreation, we identified these things, and what we talked about last week was that at their base level, the vast majority of the things that we find valuable in our culture, they're not necessarily good or evil. They're actually fairly benign. It's what we do with them that makes them good or bad. But those things really are very benign. But what's fascinating is that as we wrapped up last week, it was in like every service, there were people that came up to me and they were like, well, do I need to like get rid of my fishing poles? Like, if I'm really going to be serious about Jesus and really be salty, like, do I just like need to like sell the tennis rackets and, just all that stuff? Like, we got to just like get rid of all the recreation. Like how do we balance this life that we're living? And it's like, and the reality is that the exile name, the exile title, actually resolves this in many ways for us. Exile, it answers this question, and here's how. How do exiles live differently towards place and possessions than everybody else? They hold them loosely, right? Like they still live, an exile still lives in the culture that they've been planted in, but they live towards that culture a little differently than the people that are the citizens of that culture. Does that make sense? Like an exile lives in a culture, and while they're a part of all of the same things, there's still jobs and houses and education and titles. There's something about an exile who's living in this place from another place that holds those things a little differently. They hold them more loosely. They aren't defined by place and possession in the same sort of way. Place and possession do not define an exile. They are not defined by where they are or what they have. On the other side of that, when you think about this, you realize that the opposite is true of the citizens. There's this really interesting thing. Exiles are different, and as you look on in 1 Peter, you see him continue on with this idea of living differently in whatever place you've been planted. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, listen to what Peter continues on with this whole exile theme. Listen to how he describes the exiles. He says this. He says, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light." So he says, you, the exiles, all of you, and he's talking to us in this room. He's saying you literally are chosen people. This isn't they, this isn't some distant group, this is us. He says, you are chosen people. And then he continues and he says, you're a royal priesthood. And this is a really fascinating word because the idea of being a priest was something that was limited to a very small sliver of the population. And priests had a very specific role. And they were the ones that literally worked as the mediators between God and humanity. They were the ones that connected God with the needs and the needs with God, right? When they were involved in the lives of people and they were the ones that pointed the way to God. That was ultimately what the role of a priest was intended to be. And now what we have Peter saying is, you're chosen as exiles, and now you and you and you and you, all of you scattered living in these places, you are a royal priesthood. And so the priesthood has now been blown up and expanded to everybody who calls themselves a Christ follower, and now your role is to be this chosen person who's pointing people, involved in the lives of humanity, involved in the reality of human life, and pointing people, connecting people with God and what he desires for them. That's what he says in this. And then he continues, he says, you are a holy nation. It's fascinating because the word holy, we always think of as this, very pure, very clean. We use it in phrases like, oh, she's Miss Holier than thou, right? Like that means she's uppity, right? Holy means uppity. The Greek word hagios does not mean uppity. Peter didn't say, oh, you're stuck up, Mr. and Mrs. Goody Two-Shoes. Holy literally meant that you're set apart for the purposes of God, that you have a different reason for being than everybody else. And so he says, you are a holy nation. And so those of you that are exiles living in Bithynia and Cappadocia and Spokane, you don't find your citizenship in the boundaries or borders of the nation or city or province in which you live, but you find your citizenship literally in being a part of this nation with a purpose for God. An exiled nation. You and I have citizenship of an exiled nation, and we're scattered everywhere. We're scattered all over our city, and Christians are scattered all over the country and all over the world. But we have a nationality. There's an identity in this. He says, I want you to be different. There's a distinction about you, which means we can't go into our daily life. This cannot be. When you listen to this, you realize there is no place where we can experience spiritual aliveness for a brief moment in time and then engage life on every other level and have all of the attitudes and values that everybody else has, because we're not a part of that nation. Possession and place don't define us as exiles. Now, this has implications on a question that we're always asking, because I think this is what, there's this idea that Christians are always wondering, well, then what am I allowed to do? What am I supposed to be doing? And then what am I not supposed to be doing? And is it okay for me to do this? And hey, I heard so-and-so went and did this. Is that cool? They're a Christian. Should they be allowed to do these things? That's a question people are asking all the time. Can I do? And then they fill in the blank. Can I be a Christian and, I'm not going to fill in the blank because it's a long day and I'll say things I shouldn't say. But you get the point, right? You know what I'm talking about. This is something we wonder, right? But we're not defined the same way that everybody else is defined. We have Paul who says that all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. How do we answer the question, like, what am I really supposed to be doing with my life? The answer is found in being an exile. When you live as an exile, you're defined differently. And here's what I mean. A person who is not an exile, a person who is not one of these that Peter is referring to, your life is defined by possession and place. Your life is the sum of all of these things. The possessions, it's the cars, it's the house, it's the job, it's the education, it's the relationships, good and bad, it's the kids and their behavior and their success on the soccer field, like whatever, like you take all these things, it's the way that you recreate, it's your hobbies, it's your habits, all of these things. It's like there's this pie and you have all of these slices of the pie, and those that are not exiles, those that are citizens of this present nation or whatever, they find their identity in the place and the possession. That is the sum of their life. The whole of their life is defined by all of those things put together. That is who they are. They are defined by the content of their life. That all of life is the content. That's what makes them up. It's all of these things provide the content. That is the very content. Like, who are you? What are you about? Like, what is life? If you ask them and they describe the content of their life, it is just the summary of all of these slices. An exile is not defined that way. An exile does not allow those things or make those things the content of their life. Instead, I want you just to think about this for a moment with me. They define their life with those things as the context, but not the content. They may have the house, they may have the car, they may have the kids and the education, and they may have a certain level of recognition, and they may have the hobbies, but those things do not define who they are. That is not the summary of the content of their life. Those things are simply the context of life as an exile. Where we get into trouble, where we have problem, is when we find ourselves living in this tension of whether or not I have allowed, as an exile, things that were intended to be context to suddenly become content of my life. When suddenly I move to a place where now these things that were only intended to provide a context for living the real life that God created me for, when suddenly now I make those the content of my life. Are you tracking with me? So the beautiful thing about this is, while we strive to have rules and regulations like, is it okay, is it not okay, should I or shouldn't I? The reality is we are released from the rules-based religion, and we are introduced to a relational way of connecting with God, which means this conversation of context versus content is something that we now are having all of the time. So the reality of our faith, now it's not something that was decided for me 10 years ago and this is just what I'm supposed to do because I joined the club. No, this is one of those things that says, this week something can be context. For me, I'll give you an example. I love riding my bike. Like riding bicycles, for whatever reason, like I love it. It's ridiculous how much I love it. I love it so much that sometimes it stops being the context of my life and it becomes the content of my life. And I have to say, is this okay? And so now these things, they can be good, they can be bad. These things that are neutral, they become bad when they move from the context of life and the life God created me for, and they become the content, the very definition of who I am. When we understand that part of being an exile is not defined by possession or place, then there are things that Jesus said that were so strange that come to life. There's another place later in Matthew where Jesus is talking. Jesus is talking to a group of people. It's in the Sermon on the Mount, and in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is unpacking this whole idea of what it looks like to live out the mission and the purposes of God. And he says something that's really interesting, really strange. and hopefully it'll make sense. But in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, Jesus said this. He said, "Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you." I think for sometimes you read like these statements of Jesus and you go like, was Jesus just like the most ADD teacher on the planet where he was like bouncing from thing to thing? He's like, oh, by the way, don't cast your pearls before pigs, and and then just kind of moves on through all these things? Or was Jesus like saying something? I think sometimes we come to these moments, and when you understand what it means to be in exile, then these things start to make sense. Like Jesus literally says that there are pigs, and this is my pig, this is my flying pig. Sometimes I turn it over and I just scratch its belly, but that's a whole other thing. But this is my pig, and I've had this thing for years. And Jesus says that there are pigs in this passage. He says there are pigs. And then this morning, I went digging around in my wife's jewelry box, and I got her pearls. And Jesus says this. He says, don't do this. Do not cast your pearls before swine. Right? Don't do this, because this is bad. Right? And like for some of us, there's this urge, right? Inside of us, like you've got pearls and there's pigs, and you wake up in the morning, you're like, man, I just want to, Jesus, give me strength today because I want to cast my pearls before swine. Like there's something about this that feels so good, right? Like, and Jesus is like, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't you cast your pearls before swine. Don't do that, right? Can I be honest? Like this is one of those teachings of Jesus that when I read that, I go, okay, I got it. Like, honestly, that's not a big struggle. I don't have pigs and I have to borrow my wife's pearls. But what if Jesus is saying something else? See, what's interesting is when we look at the Bible isn't divided into all the chapters and verses the way that it is for us. That's not the way it was written. The Sermon on the Mount is one massive sermon, one massive paragraph. And so when you look at the context of when Jesus was talking about casting pearls before swine, suddenly this whole thing starts to make way more sense to us. Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, right before this, he's talking about the worries that we have. He's talking about clothing ourselves and feeding ourselves and providing shelter. And he talks about the birds of the air, and he talks about the lilies of the field, and he talks about how God loves those things enough to give them what they need. Imagine how much he gives you what you need when he loves you exponentially more. And so there's this challenge where Jesus says, why are you spending your life worrying about what you wear and how you live and all of these external things in your life? Like, quit worrying, quit spending your life chasing these things. So Jesus is just saying that. And then as you move into Matthew chapter 7, right before the casting before pearls thing, Jesus starts talking about judging. And he's saying, don't judge people, which is interesting because again, you think, oh, Jesus just switched subjects. He didn't. The reason that you and I judge is a form of control. The reason that we worry and we pursue and we chase all the things he's talking about in Matthew 6 is that we want to feel like we're in control, like there's a trust issue. And the reason that we judge others is because when we judge, we can control the situation. We can control people. We can tell people who's right and who's wrong. We can actually make ourselves feel better. When we point fingers, we're actually in a form manipulating the circumstance and depending on ourselves. And so Jesus is talking about judging because judging is another way that we worry, another way that we control, another way that we lack trust. And then he talks about pearls before swine. And then after pearls before swine, he talks about a child who comes to his father. Actually, he talks about seeking and finding. He talks about knocking and doors being opened. He talks about asking and receiving. He talks about a child coming to a father and asking for an egg. And he says, what father gives a child who asks for an egg a serpent? And it's so ridiculous that everybody's like, there isn't a father that does that. And Jesus says, why do you spend your life worrying about these things? Like God's got your back. You as exiles are cared for. So what Jesus is saying with this whole pearls before swine thing is that you and I, when you and I decide that we're going to spend our life turning what was intended to be the context for life into the content of life, this is what it looks like. We're taking the most valuable things we have. We're taking our souls, our identity, the very nature of who we are, and we're casting those things before swine. And he says, this is what it looks like when you spend your life turning context into content, it's like taking pearls and casting them before swine. It makes no sense at all. And then, apparently the pigs were meaner when Jesus was around, because he says the pigs turn and they devour you, they attack you. Which makes no sense in our world, but when you think about what happens when we throw our pearls before swine, those things devour us, don't they? Like those things that we throw everything at, those things that we give our life to, they devour us. It's about being an exile. When we live as exiles, it brings perspective to all of these things. Can I still recreate? Absolutely. Have the conversation with God. Where in this place am I living this out as an exile? Like, am I allowing this to be content, or is this continuing to be context? Am I living as a guest, as an exile in this place, pointing people to you, living for your purposes, or am I trying to control and be the host? This whole idea, everything that we're talking about, does something really remarkable. All of it, in a very strange way, communicates to all of us that we are far more important than we think we are. And I think what's interesting about this is that when the gospel first enters a person's life, one of the first things that it addresses is this self-centeredness that we all carry. But for some reason, many of us, when the gospel addresses our self-centeredness, we think it also then says something about our self-importance. But the gospel actually does something fascinating in us. The gospel actually says, I don't want you to be a self-centered. This is no longer about you. But at the same time, the gospel elevates your sense of self-importance. Not in an unhealthy way, but in an incredibly powerful way. Your life, you're told this is no longer about you. This is about the purposes, the mission of God. But you matter incredibly in this. You matter. Now, the places where you work and where you get up tomorrow and where you go, the places where you spend your energy, the things that you do to recreate, the conversations that you have, the people who you've been placed in contact with, you actually matter far more than you ever imagined. Like, that actually matters. Like, the way you interact, the way you respond to those things actually makes a difference in the renewal of all things. Your life contributes to the renewal of all things. Everything does, as you live as an exile. That's what Jesus invites us into.